The first sign something was wrong came at 3:47 hours, when Staff Sergeant Raven Maddox's radio crackled to life with a transmission that shouldn't have existed. The voice belonged to Bravo Team, the same Bravo Team that had been officially declared KIA 72 hours earlier in the mountains of eastern Afghanistan. Yet here was Sergeant Collins, his voice raw with exhaustion and something else, something that made Raven's blood run cold as she sat in the medical bay of Forward Operating Base Kestrel. Any station, this is Bravo 6 actual. We have 12 souls breathing but barely. Coordinates follow. 34799 Delta 77. Medical emergency. Repeat. Medical emergency. The transmission dissolved into static, leaving only the hum of fluorescent lights and Raven's thundering heartbeat. Lieutenant Commander Hayes burst through the medical bay doors, his steel trident gleaming against desert camouflage. His reputation preceded him. 2 silver stars, countless classified operations, a legend among legends. Behind him trailed Captain Morrison, the base commander whose skeptical expression had become permanently etched into his weathered features over 3 tours in this God-forsaken valley. Did you copy that transmission, Sergeant? Hayes demanded, his steel-gray eyes fixed on Raven with laser intensity. Raven nodded, her fingers already moving across the medical supply inventory on her tablet. She'd been expecting this moment, dreading it, ever since the official casualty report had crossed her desk. Something hadn't added up about Bravo Team's supposed demise. The coordinates were wrong, the timeline impossible, the supposed enemy contact inconsistent with known Taliban movements in that sector. Sir, those coordinates place them 15 clicks northeast of their last known position, she said, her voice steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her veins. The terrain there is impossible for standard medevac operations. We're talking about a narrow canyon system with walls that rise nearly vertical for 300 meters. Captain Morrison scoffed, adjusting his Kevlar helmet with obvious irritation. Sergeant Maddox, you're a combat medic, not a tactical analyst. Leave the impossible to those of us who specialize in it. But Hayes held up a hand, silencing his superior with a gesture that spoke volumes about the unspoken hierarchy among special operations personnel. What are you thinking, Sergeant? Raven met his gaze, feeling the weight of 12 lives hanging in the balance. I'm thinking those boys didn't die when we thought they did, sir. And if they're still alive after 72 hours in that terrain, they won't be for much longer. The silence stretched between them like a taut wire, filled with possibilities that could save lives or destroy careers. Outside, the desert wind howled through the compound, carrying with it the scent of dust, diesel fuel, and something indefinable that every soldier in theater learned to recognize: the smell of time running out. Hayes studied Raven with new interest, his tactical mind already calculating odds and alternatives. This wasn't just about a routine medical evacuation anymore. This was about the impossible made manifest, about soldiers who refused to die according to schedule, and about a combat medic whose instincts might be the only thing standing between 12 warriors and the abyss. The radio crackled again, and this time the desperation in Colin's voice was unmistakable. "Please, someone, anyone. We're running out of time." Command protocols demanded verification, confirmation, a chain of approvals that would take hours they didn't have. But Raven was already moving, her medical training overriding every bureaucratic instinct. She'd seen enough good soldiers die waiting for permission to live. These 12 weren't going to join that list, not on her watch. Hayes watched her with growing respect as she began assembling a field surgery kit with movements so fluid they seemed choreographed. "Sergeant, what's your assessment of their chances?" "Honestly, sir, in that terrain with standard extraction protocols." Raven paused, her hands never stopping their methodical preparation. "Zero. But I didn't become a medic to deal with standard situations." She looked up, meeting his gaze with eyes that held secrets and sorrows earned through countless hours under fire. Those boys trusted us to bring them home when they volunteered for this mission. The fact they're still breathing means they kept their end of the bargain. Now it's our turn. Captain Morrison shifted uncomfortably, clearly out of his depth when faced with soldiers who refused to color within the lines of conventional warfare. Sergeant, I appreciate your dedication, but we need to be realistic about our capabilities. The terrain alone makes this a non-starter. Sir, with respect, Raven replied, securing the last of her medical supplies in a tactical pack designed for situations that existed somewhere between hopeful and suicidal. Realistic stopped being relevant the moment dead men started talking on the radio. Hayes nodded slowly, recognition dawning in his expression. He'd heard whispers about Sergeant Maddox, stories that seemed too wild to be true, too consistent to be fabricated. A combat medic who'd somehow managed to keep an entire platoon operational through a 3-day firefight in Kandahar. A woman who'd crawled into a collapsed building under sniper fire to extract wounded civilians. A soldier whose medical expertise was matched only by her apparent inability to accept that some situations were beyond salvation. "What do you need from us, Sergeant?" he asked quietly. Raven shouldered her pack, checking the weight distribution with practiced efficiency. I need someone crazy enough to fly into that canyon system in conditions that would make most pilots soil themselves, sir. And I need someone with enough authority to tell everyone who thinks this is impossible to step aside and let the professionals work. The challenge hung in the air between them, as unmistakable as gunfire. Hayes found himself grinning despite the gravity of the situation. It had been too long since he'd worked with someone who understood that impossible was just another word for Tuesday in their line of work. "I think I can accommodate both requests, Sergeant, but I have one question first." "Sir, are you always this confident when the odds are completely against you?" Raven's smile was sharp as broken glass, holding promises and threats in equal measure. "Sir, if the odds weren't against us, they wouldn't need us in the first place." Outside, the sound of rotor blades began to thrum against the pre-dawn darkness, and Hayes knew that whatever happened in the next few hours would either cement Sergeant Raven Maddox's reputation as a miracle worker or serve as a cautionary tale about the dangers of hubris in combat operations. But as he watched her move with the fluid confidence of someone who'd stared death in the face so many times they'd become casual acquaintances, Hayes found himself betting on the miracle. The mission brief lasted exactly 90 seconds, delivered in the back of a Humvee racing toward the helicopter pad, while Raven triple-checked her medical supplies and Hayes coordinated air support through encrypted channels that officially didn't exist. Captain Morrison had been left behind, his protests lost in the roar of engines and the urgent rhythm of soldiers preparing for what might be their final mission. And Chief Warrant Officer Kowalski stood beside his A-60 Black Hawk, running pre-flight checks with the methodical precision of a man who'd survived 200 combat missions by treating every detail like a potential death trap. His bird bore scars from previous encounters, patched bullet holes, stress fractures in the fuselage, a replacement tail rotor that didn't quite match the factory specifications. But Raven had flown with Kowalski before, and she knew that beneath the battle damage lay a machine maintained with obsessive care by a pilot who understood that perfection was the only acceptable standard when other people's lives depended on his skills. "Ma'am," Kowalski said, his voice carrying the particular brand of respect reserved for those who'd earned their reputation under fire. "I've reviewed the coordinates. That canyon system is going to be tighter than a coffin, with wind shear that'll try to slam us into the rocks every few seconds. Visibility is going to be near zero once we drop below the rim, and the LZ is approximately the size of a basketball court, assuming it exists at all." Raven nodded, securing her gear in the helicopter's cargo bay with movements that spoke of countless similar preparations. Chief, I need you to know that once we're down there, medical protocols might require us to stay longer than tactical wisdom would suggest. How much longer? However long it takes to stabilize 12 soldiers who have been keeping death at bay for 3 days through sheer stubbornness, and whatever medical supplies they had on hand. Kowalski whistled low, a sound that conveyed more than words ever could about the complexity of what they were attempting. Ma'am, no disrespect, but most medics would call that scenario a lost cause. Chief, Raven replied, checking the seal on her morphine supply one final time. Most medics haven't spent their careers learning that the difference between hopeless and challenging is usually just a matter of perspective. Hayes climbed into the aircraft, his personal weapon secured but ready, knowing that their mission had moved far beyond standard operating procedures into territory where success would be measured not in tactical objectives achieved, but in heartbeats preserved against impossible odds. The weight of command pressed against his shoulders like a physical force, but beneath it lay something else: anticipation. It had been too long since he'd worked with soldiers who viewed the impossible as merely another problem requiring creative solutions. The helicopter lifted off into pre-dawn darkness, its rotors chopping through air thick with dust and the promise of violence. Below, forward operating base Kestrel shrank into a collection of lights that seemed insignificant against the vast emptiness of the Afghan landscape. Ahead lay mountains that had swallowed countless soldiers over centuries of warfare, peaks that held secrets and stories that would never be told in official reports. Raven pressed her face against the window, watching the terrain scroll past with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read landscape like a medical chart. Every ridge, every valley, every patch of vegetation told a story about what lay ahead. The coordinates placed Bravo Team in a section of mountains that appeared on few maps and existed in the nightmares of every pilot who'd attempted operations in the region. 30 minutes to target. Kowalski announced through the intercom, his voice steady despite the turbulence that rattled the aircraft like dice in a cup. Hayes leaned forward, activating the secure communication system that would connect them to whatever remained of Bravo Team. Bravo 6 Actual, this is Rescue 1 Alpha. We are inbound your position with medical support. Sitrep over. The response came through layers of static and interference. Colin's voice weak but determined. Rescue 1 Alpha, Bravo 6 Actual. We have 12 personnel, multiple trauma injuries, critical medical supplies exhausted approximately 18 hours ago. Current status. The transmission faded, leaving only empty air and the sound of rotors fighting against mountain winds. Raven grabbed the microphone, her training overriding protocols that typically restricted communication to command personnel. Bravo 6, this is Medic Alpha. What's your most critical injury? A different voice responded, younger, strained with pain and exhaustion. Medic Alpha, we've got sucking chest wounds, suspected internal bleeding, compound fractures, and at least 3 cases of severe dehydration. Sergeant Martinez hasn't regained consciousness since yesterday. Copy that, Bravo 6. Hold tight, we're coming for you. She released the microphone, her mind already cataloging supplies and procedures, calculating dosages and treatment priorities with the cold efficiency that had kept her functional through situations that would have broken less experienced medics. 12 soldiers with multiple trauma injuries, no medical support for 3 days, located in terrain that made standard evacuation procedures impossible. The mathematics of their situation were stark and unforgiving. But mathematics had never accounted for the human element, for the stubborn refusal of soldiers to die according to statistical projections. Raven had seen men survive injuries that should have been fatal within minutes, had watched broken bodies respond to treatment through sheer force of will. The human spirit, she'd learned, was a variable that no equation could properly quantify. The helicopter began its descent into the canyon system, and Raven felt the familiar tightness in her chest that always preceded operations where the margin for error approached zero. Outside the windows, rock walls rose like cathedral spires, their surfaces scarred by centuries of wind and weather. The space between them grew narrower with each passing moment, until it seemed impossible that any aircraft could navigate the passage without destroying itself against the stone. Kowalski's voice came through the intercom, tight with concentration. Visual contact with possible LZ, initiating approach. Below them, a narrow strip of rocky ground appeared between towering walls of stone. Scattered across its surface were shapes that might have been rocks or equipment or bodies, impossible to determine from their current altitude and speed. But as the helicopter descended further, details became clearer, and Raven's trained eye began to pick out the unmistakable forms of soldiers arrayed in a defensive perimeter around what appeared to be an improvised medical station. There, she said, pointing toward a cluster of figures near the center of the makeshift landing zone. That's them. Hayes followed her gaze, counting silhouettes through the dust and downdraft from their rotor wash. I see movement. They're alive. The helicopter touched down with a shudder that spoke of minimal clearance on all sides. Kowalski's skills as a pilot evident in the way he'd managed to squeeze a 70-foot aircraft into a space that seemed half that size. Before the skids had fully settled, Raven was moving, her medical pack secured, and her mind already focused on the triage decisions that would determine which of these 12 soldiers would see another sunset. Stay with the bird, Hayes called to Kowalski. If this goes sideways, we're going to need immediate extraction. Roger that, sir. But if you're not back in 30 minutes, I'm coming to find you. Raven hit the ground running, her boots finding purchase on rocky terrain that seemed designed to twist ankles and end careers. Around her, the canyon walls rose like the walls of a cathedral, blocking out most of the sky and creating an environment that felt simultaneously protective and claustrophobic. The air was thin at this altitude, each breath requiring conscious effort, But her training had prepared her for operations in environments where the atmosphere itself was hostile to human life. The first soldier she reached was Corporal Davis, his face gray with blood loss but his eyes alert and tracking. A crude pressure bandage covered what appeared to be a shoulder wound, applied with the kind of field expedient technique that spoke of soldiers doing whatever was necessary to keep each other alive in the absence of proper medical care. "Medics here," Davis croaked, his voice barely audible over the sound of the helicopter's idling engines. "Thank God. Martinez is in bad shape. Collins, too." Raven knelt beside him, her hands already moving over his injuries with practiced efficiency. The shoulder wound was serious but not immediately life-threatening. Muscle damage, possible nerve involvement, but the bleeding had been controlled. "You did good work with this bandage, Corporal. How long since injury?" 2 days, maybe 3. Lost track of time down here." She moved to the next soldier, then the next, conducting a rapid triage assessment that would allow her to prioritize treatment based on who could be saved and who was beyond help. It was the most brutal aspect of combat medicine, the necessity of making decisions that reduced human beings to mathematical equations of survivability versus resource allocation. But as she worked, Raven began to realize that these weren't soldiers who'd been waiting passively for rescue. Despite their injuries, despite 3 days without proper medical care, they'd organized themselves into a functional unit. Weapons were positioned for all-around defense. Injured personnel had been moved to positions that offered both concealment and fields of fire, and their improvised medical station showed evidence of sophisticated trauma treatment performed with minimal resources. "Who's been handling medical?" she called out. "Rodriguez," came the reply from several voices simultaneously. Raven looked toward the center of their perimeter, where a young soldier with blood-stained sleeves was bent over an unconscious figure she assumed was Martinez. As she approached, Rodriguez looked up, his eyes holding the particular kind of exhaustion that came from trying to keep people alive when you lacked both the training and equipment necessary for the task. Ma'am, Rodriguez said, not bothering to stand. I've done what I can, but it's not enough. Martinez took shrapnel to the chest. Collins has what I think is internal bleeding, and at least 4 others have injuries beyond my ability to treat. Raven knelt beside Martinez, her hands immediately beginning the assessment that would determine his chances of survival. Sucking chest wound, partially sealed but still compromising respiratory function. Weak pulse, rapid and thready. Signs of shock progressing toward the irreversible stage. In a civilian hospital, surrounded by modern equipment and a full surgical team, his injuries would be serious but manageable. Here, in a canyon system that existed beyond the reach of conventional medical support, he was dying by degrees. But dying wasn't the same as dead, and Raven had built her reputation on understanding the difference. She opened her medical pack, pulling out supplies that represented the accumulated wisdom of decades of combat medicine. Chest seals designed for battlefield conditions, IV fluids that could replace lost blood volume, medications that could buy time for the human body to begin its own healing processes. Around her, 11 other soldiers watched with the focused attention of men who understood that their survival depended on the competence of the woman who'd appeared from the sky like an answer to prayers they'd been afraid to voice. Hayes, she called to the SEAL commander, I need you to coordinate security while I work. Rodriguez, you're my assistant. Everyone else, maintain your positions but be ready to move when I give the word. She inserted an IV line into Martinez's arm, with movements so fluid they seemed automatic, following it immediately with medications designed to support his blood pressure and respiratory function. His color began to improve almost immediately, not dramatically, but enough to confirm that her assessment had been correct. He wasn't dying because his injuries were unsurvivable. He was dying because his body, lacked the resources to fight back against trauma that had overwhelmed its natural healing mechanisms. Rodriguez, tell me about the others. Start with Collins. Abdominal pain that's been getting worse over the past day. No external wounds that I can see, but he's been vomiting blood intermittently. Vital signs are stable but declining. Internal bleeding, possibly from a ruptured organ or damaged blood vessel. Without surgical intervention, Collins would follow Martinez into shock and eventual system failure. But surgical intervention in their current location was impossible, which meant their only option was stabilization followed by immediate evacuation to a facility capable of definitive treatment. The mathematics of their situation became clearer with each assessment. 12 soldiers, multiple critical injuries, limited medical supplies, and an extraction method that could accommodate perhaps 6 personnel per flight. Even if the weather held and Kowalski could make multiple trips, they were looking at several hours of treatment in an environment that offered no margin for error. Raven began to work with the methodical precision that had earned her reputation as one of the finest combat medics in theater. IV lines, medications, wound care, patient stabilization, each action flowing seamlessly into the next as she moved through the group of injured soldiers with practiced efficiency. Around her, Hayes and the remaining able-bodied members of Bravo Team maintained security, their weapons trained on the canyon rim where any enemy forces would have to appear before they could engage. But the real enemy wasn't Taliban fighters or improvised explosive devices. The real enemy was time and the slowly weakening vital signs of soldiers whose bodies were losing the battle against injuries that demanded more sophisticated treatment than field medicine could provide. "Medic," Collins whispered as she knelt beside him, his voice weak but coherent. "Are we going to make it out of here?" Raven met his gaze, seeing in his eyes the same question that haunted every wounded soldier. Not whether they would live, but whether their sacrifice would have meaning beyond the tactical objectives that had brought them to this place. You're going to make it, Sergeant. All of you. That's a promise." She meant it, despite the odds arrayed against them. 12 soldiers had survived 3 days in conditions that should have killed them within hours, had organized themselves into a fighting unit despite injuries that would have incapacitated lesser men, had maintained hope in circumstances that would have broken the spirit of anyone who lacked their particular brand of stubborn determination. If they could do all that, she could find a way to get them home. The canyon walls around them seemed to pulse with the rhythm of helicopter rotors, and Raven realized that their extraction window was narrowing with each passing moment. Weather conditions in these mountains could change without warning, turning a difficult mission into an impossible one. But as she worked, treating injuries and stabilizing patients with supplies that were rapidly dwindling, she felt the familiar calm that always descended when her training took over completely. This was what she'd been born to do, to stand between wounded soldiers and the darkness that waited to claim them, to serve as the bridge between injury and healing, between desperation and hope. The 12 men scattered around this improvised medical station weren't just patients. They were a testament to the human capacity to endure, to fight, to refuse surrender even when surrender seemed like the only rational option. Rodriguez worked beside her with increasing confidence, following her instructions with the quick comprehension of someone who understood that learning and application had to happen simultaneously when lives hung in the balance. Under her guidance, he began to demonstrate skills that surprised both of them. An intuitive understanding of trauma medicine that suggested he might have found his true calling in the most unlikely of circumstances. "Ma'am," he said as they moved to the next patient, "I never thanked you for coming for us. A lot of people would have written us off when the official report came through." Raven paused in her work, looking around at the faces of soldiers who'd been given up for dead but had refused to accept that verdict. "Rodriguez, the day I start writing off soldiers who are still fighting is the day I hang up my stethoscope and find another line of work." Above them, The canyon walls framed a strip of sky that was beginning to show the first hints of dawn. Soon, the sun would rise over these mountains, bringing with it both hope and danger. Hope, because daylight would improve their chances of successful extraction. Danger, because it would also make them visible to any enemy forces operating in the area. Hayes appeared at her shoulder, his expression grim with tactical realities that medical considerations couldn't override. Raven, we need to talk about extraction priorities. Kowalski can't take everyone on the first run, which means some of these soldiers are going to have to wait for a second trip. She looked up from her current patient, a young private whose leg wound had been complicated by infection that was beginning to show signs of systemic spread. "Sir, I understand the tactical situation, but medical priorities don't always align with operational convenience." "I know that, which is why I'm asking for your recommendation on who goes first." The question hung between them like a physical presence, demanding an answer that would determine which soldiers received immediate access to definitive medical care, and which would have to trust their survival to field expedience and hope. It was the kind of decision that would haunt her regardless of how it turned out, the kind of choice that defined the difference between medicine as a science and medicine as an art form practiced under conditions where perfection was impossible, but effort remained absolute. Raven stood, surveying the 12 men who'd become her responsibility from the moment she'd committed to this mission. Martinez, whose chest injury required immediate surgical intervention. Collins, whose internal bleeding could prove fatal without diagnostic imaging and possible emergency surgery. The private with the infected leg wound, who would lose the limb without antibiotic therapy that exceeded her field supplies. Then there were the others, soldiers with injuries that were serious but stable, men who could survive several more hours of field treatment if necessary, but who deserved the same priority as their more critically injured teammates. 6 on the first flight, she said finally. Martinez, Collins, Henderson, Vasquez, Park, and Williams. They represent our most critical cases, but more importantly, they're the soldiers whose conditions are most likely to deteriorate rapidly without immediate intervention. Hayes nodded, activating his radio to coordinate with Kowalski. First extraction group, prepare for immediate departure. Everyone else, continue security protocols and prepare for second lift. As the first group was loaded onto the helicopter, Raven felt the familiar weight of responsibility settle over her shoulders. She would remain with the second group, continuing treatment and ensuring their stability until extraction became possible. It meant hours more in this canyon, hours during which any number of complications could arise. But it also meant that no soldier would be abandoned to face his injuries alone. The helicopter lifted off in a storm of dust and rotor wash, carrying 6 wounded men toward medical facilities that could provide the definitive treatment they needed. For those remaining behind, the sound of its departure marked the beginning of another phase in their survival story, a period when they would depend on field medicine, mutual support, and the stubborn refusal to surrender that had brought them this far. Rodriguez remained at her side, along with Hayes and 4 other members of Bravo team, whose injuries were stable enough to allow continued function. Around them, the canyon settled into a silence that seemed almost supernatural after the noise of helicopter operations, broken only by the occasional moan from injured personnel and the distant sound of wind moving through mountain passes. How long until the next lift? Rodriguez asked, checking the vital signs of a soldier whose condition had remained stable throughout the initial extraction. Depends on weather, fuel, and how quickly the hospital can process our first group, Raven replied, redistributing her remaining medical supplies to ensure optimal care for the soldiers who remained. Could be 2 hours, could be 6. And if weather slocks in. She met his gaze, seeing in his eyes the same steady determination that had kept this unit functional through 3 days of impossible circumstances. Then, we continue treatment, maintain security, and trust that our ride will come back for us when conditions permit. It was a simple statement, but beneath its surface lay the fundamental philosophy that had guided her entire career. Never quit, never surrender, never abandon soldiers who were depending on your expertise to see them through the darkest moments of their lives. These 6 men had earned the right to go home through their refusal to die when death would have been easier than continued resistance. Now it was her job to ensure they lived to claim that right. The hours that followed tested every aspect of Raven's training and experience. Without the resources of a modern medical facility, she was forced to rely on techniques that bridged the gap between current practice and battlefield expedients, developed through generations of military medicine. Wound care became an exercise in creative problem solving. Pain management required careful rationing of limited pharmaceutical supplies, and patient monitoring meant developing an intuitive understanding of each soldier's condition that exceeded what instruments could provide. But as she worked, Raven began to understand why Bravo Team had survived when survival should have been impossible. These weren't just soldiers. They were a family forged in combat, bound together by shared experiences that created trust so profound it transcended normal human relationships. They looked out for each other with intensity that made their individual survival secondary to the welfare of the group, creating a dynamic that multiplied their collective strength beyond what any individual could have achieved alone. Rodriguez proved to be an exceptional assistant. His natural aptitude for medical procedures, enhanced by an intuitive understanding of what she needed before she asked for it. Under her guidance, he began to develop skills that would serve him well if he chose to pursue medical training after his military service. More importantly, he served as a bridge between her professional expertise and the interpersonal dynamics of the team, translating her medical directions into language and concepts that resonated with soldiers who trusted him as one of their own. Hayes maintained security with the calm professionalism of someone who'd spent his career in situations where vigilance meant the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. But Raven noticed that he also kept watch over the wounded with attention that went beyond tactical necessity. He understood, perhaps better than anyone else present, that their mission wouldn't be complete until every member of Bravo team was safely evacuated to facilities capable of providing definitive medical care. The sun climbed higher in the sky, bringing with it both blessing and curse. Improved visibility that would aid their eventual extraction, but also increasing heat that would complicate medical treatment and add dehydration to their growing list of challenges. Raven adjusted her treatment protocols accordingly, increasing fluid replacement for soldiers whose injuries already compromised their body's ability to regulate temperature and blood volume. Contact. Hayes called from his position near the canyon entrance, his weapon trained on movement along the rim high above their location. Raven froze, her hands still working on a wound dressing, but her attention suddenly focused on the tactical situation that had just shifted from stable to potentially deadly. In the confined space of the canyon, even a small enemy force could pin them down indefinitely, turning their medical station into a killing ground where wounded soldiers would become casualties not of their original mission, but of their rescue attempt. Multiple personnel, approximately 200 meters southeast rim, Hayes continued, his voice steady despite the implications of contact with hostile forces. I count at least 4 individuals, possibly more. Taliban, Rodriguez asked, his voice tight with tension that reflected their collective understanding of how vulnerable they were in their current position. Unknown. But they're taking their time about approaching, which suggests either reconnaissance or preparation for coordinated assault. Raven continued her medical work, knowing that whatever happened next, her patients needed ongoing care regardless of external threats. This was the reality of combat medicine. The necessity of maintaining clinical focus, even when the environment around you devolved into chaos that threatened everyone's survival. Options, she called to Hayes, trusting his tactical expertise while making it clear that her primary concern remained the welfare of wounded soldiers who couldn't defend themselves. Limited. We can't move the wounded, can't establish effective defensive positions, and can't call for fire support without risking bringing the canyon down on top of us. It was a stark assessment that reduced their situation to its essential elements. 6 wounded soldiers, 3 capable fighters, and an unknown number of potential enemies who held every tactical advantage except motivation. But motivation, Raven had learned, could overcome odds that seemed insurmountable to those who lacked sufficient reason to fight beyond the limits of rational self-interest. Rodriguez continued treatment protocols. Hayes, maintain security but don't initiate contact unless they demonstrate hostile intent. Everyone else, stay calm and trust your training. The words sounded inadequate even as she spoke them, but they represented the best guidance she could offer in circumstances that had moved beyond the scope of normal military procedures. They were improvising now, relying on experience and instinct to navigate challenges that existed nowhere in official doctrine. Above them, the figures on the canyon rim seemed to multiply, their numbers growing as more personnel moved into positions that could only be interpreted as preparation for coordinated action. Whether that action would prove hostile remained unclear, but the tactical implications were unmistakable. Bravo team's position had been compromised. Their extraction window was closing, and their survival now depended on factors beyond their control. But as Raven worked among wounded soldiers who'd already proven their refusal to surrender in the face of impossible odds, she felt a strange sense of confidence settling over her. These men had survived 3 days without proper medical care, had maintained unit cohesion despite injuries that should have broken their effectiveness, had created hope in circumstances that offered every reason for despair. If they could accomplish all that, they could find a way to survive whatever the next few hours might bring. The mathematics of their situation remained brutal, but mathematics had never adequately accounted for the human capacity to transcend statistical predictions through sheer determination to protect those who mattered most. The radio crackled to life, Kowalski's voice cutting through static and interference. Rescue 1 Alpha to ground team. Inbound your position with second extraction. ETA 15 minutes. Ground team copies. Hayes responded, his relief evident despite professional discipline that demanded emotional control regardless of circumstances. Be advised, we have observed personnel on Canyon Rim. Unknown intentions but recommend tactical approach. Roger that. We'll coordinate with air support for overwatch during extraction. Air support meant Apache gunships. Aircraft specifically designed to provide close combat support in situations where ground forces faced superior numbers or advantageous positioning by hostile forces. Their presence would shift the tactical balance dramatically, providing both deterrent effect and actual fire support capability if the situation deteriorated into active combat. But 15 minutes remained an eternity when measured against the immediate reality of wounded soldiers, whose conditions could change without warning, potential enemy forces, whose intentions remained unclear, and extraction procedures that would require several minutes of vulnerable exposure during loading operations. Raven accelerated her treatment protocols, stabilizing patients for movement while preparing her equipment for rapid departure. Around her, the remaining members of Bravo team began their own preparations, checking weapons and ammunition while maintaining security positions that provided maximum coverage despite their limited numbers. "Ma'am," Rodriguez said, his voice carrying new authority earned through hours of medical training under the most demanding circumstances possible. All patients stable for transport. We're as ready as we're going to be. Outstanding work, Rodriguez. When we get back to base, Remind me to initiate paperwork for advanced medical training. You've got natural talent that deserves proper development. The compliment seemed to energize him, adding a note of pride to the determination that had carried him through their ordeal. It was a reminder that even in the darkest circumstances, recognition of individual excellence could provide motivation that transcended immediate survival concerns. The sound of approaching helicopters began to echo through the canyon system, growing louder with each passing moment. But instead of the single aircraft that had extracted their first group, Raven counted multiple signatures. The deeper roar of transport helicopters accompanied by the distinctive whine of attack aircraft configured for close combat support. Hayes activated his radio, coordinating approach vectors and landing sequences with air assets, whose presence represented the full commitment of military resources to ensuring successful extraction of personnel who'd already proven their worth through survival against impossible odds. Ground team is ready for immediate departure. Patience stable. Security maintained. LZ clear. Copy that. Inbound 1 minute. Above them, the figures on the canyon rim seemed to withdraw, their retreat suggesting recognition that the tactical situation had shifted beyond their ability to influence effectively. Whether they represented hostile forces deterred by superior firepower or neutral observers who'd satisfied their curiosity, their departure removed the immediate threat that had complicated extraction planning. The helicopters appeared over the canyon rim like mechanical angels, their rotor wash creating dust storms that reduced visibility to mere feet, but also provided concealment that would complicate any attempt by hostile forces to engage during loading operations. Raven grabbed her medical pack, ensuring that her remaining supplies were secured for transport, while maintaining visual contact with patients who would need her attention during the flight back to base. "Let's go home," she called to Rodriguez, her voice carrying promise and relief in equal measure. As wounded soldiers were loaded onto aircraft that would carry them to definitive medical care, Raven felt the satisfaction that came from missions accomplished despite odds that should have resulted in failure. 12 members of Bravo team had been extracted alive from circumstances that had officially killed them 3 days earlier. Living proof that determination could overcome statistical predictions when combined with competent leadership and professional expertise. But more than that, they represented something fundamental about the nature of military service. The commitment to leave no one behind, to exhaust every option before accepting defeat, to treat individual lives as irreplaceable assets worth any level of risk.